basically what happened after George Washington was elected President of the United States, he thought it would be a good idea if he had some advisors to assist him with his responsibilities as president. Okay? And so as a result, Congress agreed to that, and they created 3 departments to help the president with his work. The first was the Department of State, which helped the president handle both foreign and domestic affairs. The Department of the Treasury, which was set up to help the president with financial issues with the nation, which is going to be a big deal here in a minute. And the Department of War, that we call the Department of Defense now, to help the president, 3 M's, manage military matters. And each of those departments would have a chairman. And ironically, they referred to that person as a secretary, which really wasn't what we know as a secretary today. And that's why today we have the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of the Treasury, etc. Okay? Now, keep in mind that these members of the presidential cabinet then and today only advise the president. Who makes the final decision? The president himself. Okay? Now, this president's cabinet, anyone that was in the president's cabinet, was known as the executive department. That's on your ID sheet. Okay? The executive department is simply the name of the president's cabinet. All the men that were nominated to help advise President Washington that were in the president's cabinet would be referred to as the executive department. It is exactly the same way today. Now, you know what the executive department consisted of in those days? There were only 4 members of Washington's cabinet. Only 4. You know how many there are at the end of his presidency? 15. And I would hate to guess how many members of the executive department that President Trump has. I would say hundreds, okay, of advisors. So the first cabinet had 4 members. By the time Washington left office, he would increase that to 15. And I'm guessing President Trump has hundreds now. So let's talk about these men that were first chosen to serve in President Washington's cabinet. Our first Secretary of State was who, Andrew? Look at that ID sheet and I'll bet you'll get it. Thomas Jefferson was our first Secretary of State. You probably know him better as a President of the United States, but he was the first Secretary of State. And I really want you to pay attention to that position of Secretary of State. And in the coming elections that we're going to have, let's figure out how many Secretaries of State end up being President of the United States. I think you'll be surprised when we get through that. Okay, who was our first Secretary of the Treasury? This birthday girl. Alexander Hamilton. Very good, Alexander Hamilton. You might remember him more for being killed in a duel with Aaron Burr, which we'll talk about later on. But Alexander Hamilton would be the first Secretary of the Treasury. Now, who's going to be the first Secretary of War, Ray? You had that green sheet out, by God, you'd know. Who's the first Secretary of War going to be? Henry Knox. He had been a general in the Revolutionary War. He was the new Secretary of War. What's named after him that you wish you owned? Fort Knox. What's in Fort Knox? Lots of gold. Yep. So Fort Knox is named after Henry Knox. So he's the first Secretary of War. Now, after thinking about his appointments, kiddos, President Washington thought, you know, I'm not a lawyer. I'm probably going to need some help with legal matters. So then he established the position of Attorney General. Okay? The man that would help him with matters of law. And the first Attorney General to serve the United States of America was a guy by the name of Edmund Randolph. Edmund Randolph. Now, do you think that these terms I'm giving you are going to be on our first test, these IDs? They are. They're going to be on your test in the form of fill in the blank, short answer, true or false, maybe multiple choice, etc. Yep. He was the first Attorney General, the man that would help the President in matters of law. Now, President Washington was a little bit different than John F. Kennedy when he selected his brother as Attorney General, because President Washington took his time and he chose those 4 men in his cabinet because they were brilliant in theory and brilliant in practice. It's important you know that. They were brilliant in theory and brilliant in practice. Now, what's the difference between theory and practice? Anybody know? I'll give you a good example because this drives me nuts. If you decide to go to college someday and you want to be a teacher, they're going to teach you all kinds of theories. They're going to make you good at theory, the theory of education. They're going to teach you how to teach U.S. history. They're going to teach you U.S. history and how to teach U.S. history to kids. What they're not going to teach is when you get into class and a kid's got to get up in the middle of the room and go to the bathroom. Or Hanford back there is not paying any attention to what he's doing, which is not true, and I got to correct him. They don't teach you practice. They teach you theory in college, right? And so Washington picked these men that were really good in theory, that could teach what needed to be taught or do what needed to be done, and they were very smart in theory and they could go out and do it. They just didn't come up with the rule or the issue. They went out and made it work as well. So he wasn't picking people because they were loyal or because they were his brother or it was because he trusted them. He picked them because they were very good in theory and practice. Okay, now that's going to get us to the nuts and bolts of this whole thing, and that's basic problems of organizing a new federal government. What problems is Washington and Congress and his cabinet going to have in trying to organize a federal government? Have they ever had a federal government in the colonies? No. They all had individual colonies. They've never had an overall government. And so these newly elected officials, these new senators, these 26 senators, and these 59 representatives, right? And these four cabinet members, and the president are going to have to find a way they can establish a federal government. Okay? Now, what type of problems might the colonies have in doing that? Okay, I want you to think about that. And somebody kind of mentioned this, I think, yesterday, and I said, hold on. So what don't they have in the colonies right now? Okay, well, we're going to get to that. That's very good. We're going to, yeah, no, you're good. No, you're good. We're going to get to that. But what don't they have? She's pretty close. What don't they have? We're going to have chaos in the colonies. Each colony took care of their own business. Now we got to come up with something for all 13. What don't they have? They have no, we'll get to that. They have no judicial system. They got judicial problems because they have no federal laws. They have all kinds of now state laws. It used to be colonial laws. They have all kinds of state laws, but they have no federal laws. Now, even if they had federal laws, Mr. Padilla, what would they need once they got a law? Someone to enforce the law. So they have no law enforcement officers. Now, once you break the law and get arrested, you go to where? Court. They have no court system, right? They have no court system to make decisions. And if you go to court and are found guilty, they have no federal jails. Okay, they have jails in each state. Okay, so the first basic problem that these new leaders of the United States of America had in organizing a new federal government is they had judicial problems. No federal laws, no law enforcement officers, no court system, no place to put the offenders. Okay, that had to be fixed. Okay, what might be another problem they have that they don't have as an overall government? Very good, Brady. Financial problems. They had financial problems. Now, I'm going to piggyback on Brady. They did have currency in the colonies. Okay, they did. But the problem was because of Revolutionary War, they had very little money in any of the colonies. Okay, because they had spent it doing what? Wars cost money. Okay, wars cost money. Give you an example. The French and Indian War, which is a war that was fought prior to the American Revolution by the British, that gave them Canada, Florida, the western lands between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, a bunch of land. That war cost them $22 billion in today's dollars. So war is expensive. So number one, under financial problems, they had very little money in the new country. Number two, they were heavily in debt from the Revolutionary War. Not only did they not have any money, they were owing a bunch of money on top of it. Okay? So there's your financial problems. We're going to have four, but there's kind of like our judicial problems. First of all, number one, there's very little money in the country. Number two, the nation owned a large debt from the Revolutionary War. So what's the third problem? What do they have to do to get money? Okay, they're going to get some, they got jobs or something. That's a good point. Jobs is something they probably have, right? But what do you have a job? Have you had a job? Okay, what, when you get your paycheck, don't you like when you see your paycheck? Taxes. They had no way of collecting taxes. They got to collect taxes. How else are they going to bring revenue in? Okay, how else are they going to do that? Now think about it. They have no money. They owe a large debt. Once they get a method in place for collecting taxes, what's the next problem? Once you get this money, what's the next problem? Where are you going to put it? Because there's no federal treasury, right? So when you look at financial problems, number one, there was very little money in the new country. Number two, the nation owned a large debt from the Revolutionary War. Number three, there was no method in place for collecting taxes to raise money. And once they did that, there was no federal treasury to put the money in. Okay? What's another problem you might have overall in establishing a new country? Although they didn't like the fact that the British wanted to tax them for this in the old days, we didn't get through that. What's another problem you might have if you're a brand new country? Anybody want to guess? Not so much that. It's more of a... I'll try to put this without giving it out. What do you do when you go to bed at night? What's the last thing you maybe do with your house before you go to bed at night? Turn the lights off? Lock the doors, right? So America has defense problems, okay, defending themselves. How do you think their military was after the Revolutionary War? Strong as can be? No, they fought for several years. They had a very weak military. And when you have a weak military, you're very vulnerable to what? Attack from other countries. You don't think there's other countries going, gee whiz, if we would attack the American colonies before, we'd have been in a war with Britain. But if we attack the American colonies now, I bet they're pretty defenseless, because they have got to be weak after fighting a Revolutionary War for several years. So as far as defense problem goes, the nation had a weak military after the Revolutionary War. The nation was very vulnerable to attack from foreign countries. Now, how do you keep from getting attacked by America? How do you, okay, let's say that Logan and I, Logan's looking at me, and I mean, he'd like to be the teacher here. Okay, but he can't be the teacher because I'm the teacher. But man, I have taught all day and I'm dog tired and I got one more period. If he wanted to be the teacher, when would be the time to strike at me so he can take over up here? While I'm weak, right? But I don't really want Logan to do that. And I'm thinking, man, oh man, I think I could fight him off, but I might get hurt and I wouldn't be 100%. He wouldn't take over. So maybe what I'd do with Logan is what? Make peace. Very good. They call that foreign policy. And the problem that the United States had is they had not developed any foreign policy or put any relationships together with foreign countries. So what they needed to do is get together with France and say, hey, I want to be your buddy. What can we give you? Oh, you like our cotton? Let us send some over to you. Then you won't attack me. We'll be buddies. Those are foreign relations. You got to have foreign policy. You got to get along with countries outside of you. So as far as defense problems, got a very weak military after the Revolutionary War, number one. This made them very vulnerable to attack from foreign countries, number two. And to keep people from attacking them, they didn't even have any foreign policy to convince these people that that would not be the thing to do. Now, what's the last problem they had? We've talked about, I'll give you this one, and then we're going to get to what you said, is they had unity problems. Unity problems. Okay? Now, I can compare this to teachers, in a way. I'm part of the social studies department. There's myself, and Mr. Vickers, and Mr. Dorn, and Mr. Hoffman. Okay? We're a country. Okay? But I've been doing this a lot longer than all those guys. And so I think I'm pretty smart, and I've been doing this a while, so I'm going to do it my way. So all of a sudden we have this new concept in our school called PLC, which is professional learning communities, where the big educational jargon now is to work together, unified within your departments, so that every kid gets a quality education, whether they take me for U.S. history, or Mr. Dorn, or Mr. Vickers, or Mr. Hoffman. We all should get the same thing, okay? It's not a bad concept. That's kind of what I'm talking about here. You have to have unity. Well, I don't really want to have to, you know, Mr. Vickers and I teach U.S. history. I don't want to work with him. I'm saying this in jest before. I don't want to work with him. He doesn't know what he's doing. I think I'm smarter than him. I'm going to do my own thing, and he can do his own thing, and we'll just let chips fly where they go. Well, that's kind of the same philosophy that these colonists had at the time. Because you've got to remember that the people in the United States didn't believe that they were a part of the United States of America. They were from Massachusetts, or they were from Virginia, or they were from Georgia, or they were from South Carolina. And they weren't overly interested in uniting into one country, because things were going pretty good in South Carolina. Now, if things weren't going very good for you in Delaware, would you be more interested in uniting? Maybe you owe a lot more money from the Revolutionary War in Virginia, because that's where a lot of it was fought, than they did in Georgia, for example. So you think Georgia wants to unite and give all their money to Virginia to get them out of debt? So unity is a problem here. So people in the United States believe themselves as citizens of individual states, not an overall federal system. So the federal government's going to have to take steps to abolish each of these 13 states from having their own independent government. How do you think that's going to work? Probably not very good. They're not, you know, the good states are going to want to be on their own. Now, I'm not comparing teachers, I'm making a point. The good teacher thinks that I'm going to keep doing things the way I've been doing them. I'm not going to, you know, give my knowledge over here to him, because he might get better. And of course, I don't want him to bring me down. So these states were very ununified. And that was going to be a problem for these government leaders to get taken care of. Now, in order for all states to follow the same rules, what did they have to develop? You said it before. The Constitution, United States Constitution. So what these governmental leaders did is they got together and they said, we better get together and pass a United States Constitution. This will ensure that all states are required to follow the same rules. And that's where the U.S. Constitution came from. The reason it was passed was to unify all of these colonies, now states, into one federal government. So do you understand the problems that they had to deal with? I guarantee you these will be on the test. We'll go over this when we get close to it. But I'll ask you, I'll say list the problems that George Washington and his advisors had in establishing a new federal government. And you're going to go back in your notes and you're going to study this and you're going to say, let me look here. Oh, they had judicial problems. You might say, tell me the problems they had in one example of each. Judicial problems. You could say there were no federal laws. You could say there was no law enforcement officers. You could say there was no court system. What's the other problem? Financial problems. We didn't have any money. We owed a large debt from the Revolutionary War. We had no method of collecting taxes. And then we didn't have any place to put the money when we collected it. So I'm not going to ask you for all of those, but you're probably going to need to know, well, not probably, you're going to need to know each one of the problems, at least an example of each. We had defense problems. We were very weak after the Revolutionary War, or the nation was very vulnerable to attack after the Revolutionary War, or we didn't have any foreign policy. And we had unity problems because people were more interested in the individual states than they were the federal government. And because of that, we had to write something called the United States Constitution. Okay, that'll take us to our next subtopic then, which is Congress goes to work. Now we're going to break down each one of these problems and tell you how Congress fixed them. Okay? We're going to break down all of these problems and tell you how Congress fixed them. So, Ray, what's the first problem we talked about that they had? What kind of problems were they? That was the second. What was the first? Judicial problems. So we're going to talk about that first. So, the first and most important thing that Congress did to solve the judicial problems in the United States is they passed a law called the Judiciary Act of 1789. It's on your green sheet. So one of the first and most important measures that Congress adopted to take care of this judicial problem was they passed the Judiciary Act of 1789. Anybody want to guess what that did? Think about the problem we had and the examples. What did the Judiciary Act of 1789 do? What did we need to have for any of those things to work? We had no laws, no law enforcement officers, no courts, right? No jails. So what did the Judiciary Act of 1789 do? It established what in America? The very first one ever. Court system. Very good. It established the very first court system. You can't have any laws, you can't have any law enforcement officers, and you can't have any jails if you don't have a court system. So what the Judiciary Act of 1789 did is it established the first federal court system in America. Did they have court systems in these individual colonies, you think? Yeah, but they were colonial. Now, let's talk about this. Once they established the first federal court system in America, then they had to establish branches of that. If somebody got in trouble in Massachusetts, were they going to come to one court somewhere among the 13 colonies? They're going to travel from Massachusetts if the court system, the federal court system is in Georgia? No, so what did they have to, within that federal court system, what did they have to establish? District courts, right? One in each state. So how many would there be? 13. So the first thing that this federal court system did that was established by the Judiciary Act